Hello and welcome. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360. Coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. It's Friday, and so this is when we review all of the happenings over the last week. For those of you that are new, every week our offensive security team is tracking, researching, and analyzing threats, exploits, all the crazy stuff going on out there with the end goal of keeping you up to date and making you maybe a little bit more prepared today than you were yesterday to protect your organization. So today, as usual, right, you got Mr. Spencer and Brad, and yeah, man, we got some cool stuff to talk about.
Yeah, awesome. Looking forward to it. So in this week's review, we're talking about macros, coin miners, Rustomware, and cookie phishing. So lots of good stuff, some clickbait buzzwords for us to talk about today. So the first kind of topic on the agenda is Microsoft and their kind of debauchery of the announcements of macros and the misunderstandings and misconceptions and all of the things that come with it. So hopefully we'll kind of tell you what's going on, what's the latest from Microsoft on that. And the TLDR is they are not, they're only pausing the waiting on disabling internet macros or macros from internet-borne documents, Office documents temporarily. So just a few days ago or last week, Microsoft said that they were temporarily pausing their changes to disabling macros by default on those internet-borne documents. So they released an article and it says, this is a temporary change. We're fully committed, all that, normal stuff. And they said, they don't have a timeline, but they'll update in a couple weeks, when they expect this to happen. So if you've been following this, Microsoft said they were going to disable macros by default, and they went back on it just recently, and now they're saying, it's only on pause temporarily. The important thing to know is that, the blocking macros by default is great, but it's not required for us to protect those macros. We can still enable a group policy that will block those macros from running. And that's what we recommend, right? Don't wait for Microsoft to push out the defaults. If you can, go and deploy that group policy to block macros from running in Office files from the internet. And that'll help kind of get you ready for when those macros are blocked by default. The other important thing I think is something to talk about when discussing this is mark of the web. And that's really what we're talking about here. And mark of the web is an attribute that gets added to a Windows file when it's from an untrusted source like the internet, right? Mm-hmm. So when that file gets saved to your system, like a Word document gets saved to your system that has a macro, it has this mark of the web attribute in the file. And that's how the file knows that it came from an untrusted source. And that's essentially what it's using to either block the macros, not allow them to open, or let them open. Right. And the caveat with this is archive files. And this is where we're seeing a lot of initial access and phishing come in, is threat actors are smart and they're using things like 7-zip or WinZip or just zip archives in general, because what happens is they will send you a phishing email. It'll be a zip file. That zip file has maybe a macro laid in Word document, right? Mm-hmm. Well, when you unarchive that zip file, the mark of the web gets removed from that file attribute, depending on the software you use and some other factors. Mm-hmm. So that's how these threat actors are getting around the mark of the web. So I bring that up to say that it's important to consider the type of archive software that you're using and whether or not they honor that mark of the web flag when unarchiving and using their product. Things like WinZip, 7-zip, etc., may or may not honor that mark of the web and pose additional risk if your users are using that. Yep. So a couple things to think about, but this is an attack vector that's not going away anytime soon. So definitely block those macros to the best you can and educate users on the 7-zip software and zip software.
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest part of this is the layered approach, right? Is we're not implying that we're relying on Microsoft to do this for us, although there are a lot of folks out there that are undereducated or understaffed that need all the help they can get. And so it's
Yep.
still kind of baffling to us that we wouldn't have this, right?
Yep.
At least, blocked by default when we can. So,
yep, definitely. So this will continue to be a story, and we'll keep updating you as we get new information from Microsoft and these things change.
It's important. It's a big deal, which is why we keep kind of coming back to it as it develops.
Yep. Cool. So the next article or resource and that I wanted to share was from the DFIR report. So this one is kind of interesting. And the reason it's interesting is it's kind of a run-of-the-mill intrusion by a threat actor that deploys a coin miner. The way they get in is through a public-facing Microsoft SQL Server. They brute force the SA account for that public Microsoft SQL Server. They do some privilege escalation and persistence, and then they ultimately deploy the coin miner.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing to me in this case was the way that they used this binary managed object format file, this BMOF file. It deployed the miner itself, and it was also used for persistence. And what they used is this MOFComp binary, which does some magic, and you can do some cool stuff with it. The kind of the TLDR of this, or layman's term of this, is they used this binary to create a WMI event subscription. So they created a custom WMI subscription on this host, and then used that for their persistence mechanism. Mm-hmm. And the reason I thought this was kind of interesting is when you look for this binary, they call them oftentimes lol bins, right? LOL bin, living off the land binaries. Mm-hmm. Other examples of this are like run DLL32 and regserve and those kinds of things that have some capabilities to execute code. MS build is another one, right? Yep. So there's these living off the land binaries that allow us to execute scripts or download files or whatever it might be. This one, I went and looked it up, and there's not a lot of information on it. On the lolbins website, this doesn't even exist. There is one issue on GitHub for the lolbins website that talks about this, but I thought it was interesting because there's not a lot of information around this that I could find.
Definitely homegrown.
It's kind of an interesting WMI persistence mechanism. And I know it's not necessarily new, and other researchers have written about this, but I thought it was interesting that we see coin miners, groups that deploy coin miners as traditionally not very sophisticated, right? Script kiddies, kind of copy paste kind of things. But this I would consider maybe a little bit more sophisticated for a group that deploys a coin miner. So kind of interesting to see that being deployed with a coin miner. So that's why I kind of thought it was interesting. It's kind of a sneaky persistence mechanism that ultimately downloads stage 2, and that runs at a certain time every day for persistence.
That's pretty cool. I like it. And I want to be that guy for just like 2 minutes. Okay. The first 4 things for initial access Number 1, I have SQL Server listening on the internet. Immediate fail, right?
Yep.
If we even see that on the public internet during penetration testing or whatever services we're doing, it's an immediately flag on the play, lose 10 yards, right?
Yep.
And so then we have the default SA account is enabled. B, the password is so poor that the bad guy got it in 27 hours. Okay. And keeping in mind, by the way, this is not like an offline attack where you're getting millions of attempts per second with Hashcat. This is a literal login attempt over the internet, right? So that is a relatively slow process, meaning that the number of logins that they went through was small relative to normal attacks. And finally, the fourth and final is we're not logging failed login attempts. And so literally, again, my favorite phrase, right? Blocking and tackling.
Yep.
All 4 of those just out of the, oh, I forgot one. XP command shells enabled.
Yep.
The first thing you ever do on SQL Server is disable XP command shell and rename the SA account. Like out of the gate,
Yep.
right? Before you even complete the installation wizard, man.
Yep.
So anyway, long story short, like I was just reading through that and I was like, no, it hurts to read this because of all of the failures in hardening that SQL box.
Yeah. Yeah. Really good lessons and really good takeaways from this DFIR report. And I say this every time we talk about these. I love reading these. This is actual in the trenches, tradecraft going on. So it's interesting to read these. I pick up things. I learn things that I can potentially implement in penetration tests. I learn ways to help the defensive side, as well. So the WMI persistence mechanism particularly is really interesting. It's something I plan to research further because I think that's really cool.
Did you mean to say that you plan to use it further in your internal penetration testing?
Yeah, exactly.
I was thinking about that relative to what we were working on this week, where we were having trouble getting persistence, and I don't know that this would have defeated that, but
yeah, it'd be interesting to try. I don't know if it necessarily would in this situation particularly, but something to keep in mind and something to kind of research and play around with and see, because I venture to guess that there's not a whole lot of telemetry to observe those custom event subscriptions.
right.
But it'd be something that I'd be interested in see and test and running by a couple of EDR products and see, how much visibility they have into these things.
Yeah, because right off the top of my head, the first thing that comes to mind is your detection window is very small, because the most noise you're going to see, assuming that these EDR products are not polling for those new subscriptions and then investigating them, the creation of the service is probably your detection opportunity.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And then beyond that, though, I don't know how many endpoint products are going to be monitoring custom services.
Yeah.
Generally, the answer is none. But this stuff changes so frequently. I wouldn't want to wager on that.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting one. It's an interesting report, because you could take these techniques and emulate them in your environment or in a lab, right? And see, does my AV product, does my EDR pick up on this stuff? If I run a MOF file, using this lulbin, is that something that gets picked up, right? Is that something that gets alerted on or even logged, right? So some things, that's why I love these things, is it gives us additional information of things to try and things to look for that are being used by threat actors to see if we could see it. If something happened like this in our environment, would we see it? So
yeah, this one article generates, a dozen questions.
Yep.
From initial access all the way through to detection on persistence and stuff like that. So, and to your earlier point, right? If you live in a technical security role, pen testers, defenders, investigators, whatever it is, and you're not reading this report, then I think you're wrong.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. I always look forward to these, and they do a really good job. They're very detailed, and they also, at the end of the articles, they provide indicators, right? Hashes, file names. There's commands that you can pull down from the report, right? That you can test and use as signatures. But they also have a lot of times custom Sigma rules that they've created as a result of the report or the investigation. So there's Sigma rules, they might have Yara rules, and all sorts of stuff like that to kind of speed that detection along. So awesome stuff. Really good.
Yeah.
The next one is Hive Ransomware. In the top of the show, I called it Rustomware. I'm hereby coining that phrase, Rustomware. I don't know if that's cool or not, but maybe we need like a cheesy logo and paint or something with our name on it to say, Rustomware. I'm sure somebody else has used that before, but I'm stealing it.
Yeah, it's yours, man.
Yeah. So Hive, they're about a year old. I think they were first observed, according to this article, in June 2021. According to Microsoft and some other researchers, they are one of the most or one of the fastest evolving ransomware families. And there's been a lot of activity in the ransomware ecosystem lately, from ransomware as a service to human operated, groups, hands-on keyboard type things. It's been a lot of activity, and Hive is just another example of that. They've recently fully migrated, I guess, their ransomware code from Golang or Go to Rust. Now, Rust is an interesting language for a number of different reasons, but kind of the reason we're seeing the shift, or one of the reasons, is it's a decent language. It's fairly decent to code and understand and write and read. And it has some advantageous features that you would want in a programming language to create malware for. And it's it's a little bit more difficult to reverse engineer Rust malware than something like C# or Golang or something like that. And one of the other reasons is we see the shift from, started with PowerShell, and that was abused, and then C#, and then it was Python and NIM and Rust. So that's kind of the shift we're seeing, is AMZ, built-in AMZ provider or protection in Windows, is getting really good at detecting stuff like VBScript and .NET and Microsoft-based languages in Windows. So attackers know that, and they're shifting languages. And Rust is one of those languages that they're picking up because it's the code is less signatured, right? The features that they're implementing are going to be less signatured than other languages. And in this article, they talk about all of the kind of key findings of this ransomware and how they've got improved encryption, new ransomware note, and a whole bunch of stuff. And it's a fairly detailed article, kind of reversing this new malware.
So is the drive to keep changing languages, is that just the never-ending push for evasion and being difficult to track and detect and such? Do you think there are other benefits maybe with this language they didn't have with Go?
Yeah, I think there's maybe some programming benefits to certain features. Maybe certain programming languages will have better thread protection or handle memory better in a better way or a different way that makes it harder to detect. But I do think a lot of it is evasion and signature-based avoidance stuff based on my knowledge of it. I'm not an expert malware engineer or malware developer or reverse engineer by any means, but it seems like the trend is we get a language, we use it while it's effective and it's not highly signatured. And then when it starts getting more detected, or there starts to be more protections around it, like PowerShell and C# and .NET type languages, then we move on, find a different language. This is pretty evident if you look at the shift from PowerShell to C# to NIM, Rust, etc., Go.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it is evasion, avoiding signature-based detection, and then a little bit of it is probably the actual components and the capabilities of the language itself.
That makes sense. And a lot of these newer languages are designed and built with speed of development in mind, and so I think that was one of the big attractions to Go originally for developers. Now, I don't know necessarily that this speaks to malware writers, but in the commercial space, the rapid development was a big draw, and just ease of reading and writing. So, I have to imagine that probably plays in a little bit here too.
Yeah, I would think so. And in some of these programming languages allow you to embed other interpreters or other languages inside of them. So that's something that's fairly common too. There's a couple C2 frameworks like Silent Trinity that allows you to kind of embed other .NET based languages within another language kind of thing. So it's kind of like engine coding engine or engine inception, they call it, where you can embed things into other things. So pretty interesting stuff. I think we'll continue to see this trend. The popular ones right now I know are NIM, Rust. Those are two that really come to mind that we've seen threat actors take advantage of from programming languages. So we'll see this trend shift, and as we get better detections for it, we'll see them shift again, and this will be nothing new in that sense.
Sure, makes sense.
Cool. So the last one is something I'm excited to hear you talk more about from the technical aspects of the phishing sites and things like this. So this is another article from Microsoft. It does read as like a sales guide, or a sales like pitch marketing brief thing, but we're going to talk about the good things, the important things to take away from it, and not necessarily like shilling out for Microsoft.
Right.
So Microsoft has an article about something called Adversary in the Middle phishing, and essentially what this is there's been a large scale phishing campaign that's attempting to essentially steal users' session cookies as opposed to their credentials, and use that to kind of bypass multi-factor authentication protections and sign in as that user, and then carry on business email compromise, fraud, and things like that. So this is quite interesting, and something that I think would be cool to hear you talk about more, Brad, of, the actual, what does this mean? What does this look like from a layman's term standpoint, and how do we kind of protect against it?
Sure. Yeah, this is a little bit unique in that it combines a couple of different attacks. So I will say that the concept of this attack is not new, but the way that it's being executed with the intention of bypassing MFA and capturing sessions is interesting. In a normal phishing scenario, the bad guys are going to set up a web page, and that web page will emulate the real website. And when a user clicks it, they put in their credentials, and poof, those credentials get saved off and whatever. In this case, though, that's not going to get you anywhere when you have MFA enabled resources. And so what we're doing here is we're creating a forwarding or a redirection website that the attacker controls. And it's basically just facilitating authentication for the user. Right. So the real user is involved, and the real website, in this case, it's, O365. But in the middle, the user is actually visiting a site that is not Microsoft site. And the attacker's code is basically on the back end, establishing the MFA and establishing the credential process, so that when that session finally gets created, what ends up happening is the user just successfully logs in. It's like nothing ever happened, but the bad guy is also stealing that session data, and they have their own access at that point to that email inbox. And so, you still have to go through the normal phishing process, right? So this stuff still comes into the inbox, probably in a zip file, maybe as an HTML attachment, just in getting the user somehow to go visit. And I think this one was a visual voicemail or audio voicemail, something like that. And so, there's a couple of things at play here that are important for us as defenders and attackers. Looking at it from a defender perspective, a couple of things are occurring. The number one thing that you should consider is that the user is going to a site that probably doesn't have a reputation, right? And so, in the case here, it's just meant to look kind of like a Microsoft login URL, and it's pretty convincing. Like, it looks really, really good, but again, this is going to be the domain is not going to have a reputation, which means if you are filtering at the perimeter, your outbound internet traffic, you kill this thing. Which you should also, by the way, be intercepting attachments and inspecting message bodies using your email security platform, which, by the way, should be sandboxing, exploding out attachments, and following links. So there are a couple of, what I think consider to be fundamental things going on here that would really help a lot. But I just think it's super neat, the sophistication of, spinning this thing up, getting a pretty convincing domain, and then being smart enough to just kind of manage that authentication process. Super, super cool stuff for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not easy. Anyone who's done kind of phishing exercises from an offensive perspective, it's not easy anymore to just buy a website or buy a domain and stand up a website and have users click on it. No, less sophisticated organizations or those who are newer to the kind of phishing technique will fall for it. But if you're going up against a mature organization that's got a blue team and they've got some cycles through this and they've seen this kind of thing before, they have good protections in place and good controls for email and looking at the trustworthiness of the domain, right? Looking at the age of the domain when it was registered and the reputation and how it's categorized. It's hard, it's hard to get a decently aged domain and do this. So it's not a trivial thing. And to see this, working in such an effective way is a pretty telling thing of how powerful this technique can be. So yeah, I think it's an interesting case to look at in kind of test yourself and see, okay, if we come up against this, is our email filtering solution going to block the email, or is my content filtering system going to detect this is kind of a new domain or a suspicious website or something like that? So there's a number of things, like you said, in place, the layers that will help with this, but an interesting case nonetheless.
Sure. And there are things, if you have a higher subscription in O365, that can be done also, because what you're going to get is the source of the login is going to end up being like AWS, and so it's going to be a different login source than the original user. And so, actually, so the article even covers some of the defensive techniques, but yeah, moral of the story is you need to be blocking uncategorized internet sites, period. Right at the perimeter. You should have WCCP enabled, which, for those of you who don't know, basically forces HTTP traffic to go through a proxy. And you should have that turned on, and then you should have a proxy server that's blocking categories that you don't want, which include everything in this article.
Yeah.
And, so yeah, little stuff like that,
Yep. And conditional access, something we didn't talk about, but conditional access can help here, where it's looking at different signals, the IP address, location of the IP, browser, user agent strings, all sorts of things that put together kind of a risk profile and say, okay, this might be risky, this might not be, to help mitigate this.
Agreed. Defense in depth, man. For sure.
Yep. Yeah, I think that was the last story. So that's it.
It's good stuff. I like it, man. These are always fun. They're always fun, and I like the opportunity to talk about them and kind of bring them back to the forefront of what we have going on. So cool. So listen, folks, that's all we have for you this week. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, subscribe, share. Sharing is the biggest thing for us, right? We just want we want folks to be able to consume the content if they're interested. So share it with your friends. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
See ya.
Have a good one.